Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Carrot Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1992 horror drama movie titled Candyman. Now, Candyman runs for 1 hour and 41 minutes long. It is directed by Bernard Rose. It is produced by Steve Golan, Sigurjón Sigvatsson, and Alan Poole. The script was also written by Bernard Rose, based off of the short story The Forgiven by Clive Barker. It is composed by Philip Glass, the cinematography by Anthony B. Richmond, and it was edited by Dan Ray. And the stars of the movie are Virginia Madsen, Tony Todd, Xander Berkley, Cassie Lemmons, Vanessa Estelle Williams, DeJuan Guy, Gilbert Lewis, Carolyn Lowery, Stanley DeSantis, Mariana Elliott, Ted Raimi, Michael Culkin, Bernard Rose, Eric Edwards, Rusty Schwimmer, Lanesha Martin, and Terrence Riggins. So the story goes a little bit of how did the Candyman's origin come about. Well, it all started in the late 1800s. A son of a slave has found his way out of the doldrums of slavery in the life as he became a dependable artist, as people came from all around to get their portraits done of him. Now, Candyman's father was also a slave, but he kind of got his emancipation when he came up with a solution for manufacturing shoes at a much faster, more efficient rate. Like I said, Candyman was a genius, being the fact that he was a very successful artist. People were just lining up to get their portraits done of him. But he committed probably one of the most heinous, most despicable, most conniving acts going. And if you can hear the tone of voice, it's sarcasm. Yes, he committed the big baddest faux pas ever. He fell in love with a white woman. Oh, and he got her pregnant. And she also happened to be married. So yes, he fell in love with a Caucasian woman and fathered a child from their relationship. This didn't sit well at all with her father, and he sent a mob over to lynch him. They cut off his right hand, and since then was replaced with a hook. Then they smeared honeycomb all over him that they stole from an apiary in which he succumbed to his death from the multiple bee stings. Since his death, he has haunted the residents of the Cabrini Green projects in Illinois by anyone who dares to look into the mirror and say his name 5 times. His physical appearance consists of an African American man wearing 19th century style zoot suit, he wears almost like a woolen fur coat, but when he unzips his fur coat or unbuttons his fur coat, you can see his rib cage with millions of bees swarming around him. Sometimes some of these bees come out of his mouth. He is a hideous manifestation. And if you say his name 5 times, he will kill. But he's not here to kill for the sake of pleasure. Him annihilating his victims gives him power, not pleasure. His legend, his legacy, and his reputation is what makes him who he is. And if you dare to defy his legacy or his legend, then he will kill the people in your life, while the perpetrator who calls his name, whoever he or she may be, will eventually have to call to the Candyman. But the question in this movie throughout the whole facade is, does the Candyman truly exist? Or is he all just a myth? Like the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot? And this is kind of like something that happens throughout the entire movie. Loosely based off of the short story by Clive Barker called The Forbidden, what makes Clive Barker's stories stand out above any other horror story writers is that he takes a particular trope that's familiar to the horror genre, in this case the urban legend, and then molds it into a different kind of entity. In the case of Candyman, he manipulates the concept of the myth and plays with the viewer's mind, at the same time deciding if Candyman does exist or is he just a legend. We see this throughout the whole movie as we follow a young college student named Helen Lyle, played by Virginia Madsen, who's working on a thesis based off of urban legends. And of course, the urban legend that comes closest to her home is the Candyman. Is he real? Or is he just a manifestation in the mind? Like all the other great legends. Whether it be Bigfoot. Does Bigfoot exist? Or was that old 1967 video footage just some guy dressed in a monkey suit posing to the camera? Was the Loch Ness Monster real? Or was it just a mere submarine that materialized in Lake Nessie in Scotland? People might have said that these creatures are real. And then there are the skeptics out there who says it's all just bogus. So is the Candyman real? Or is he just a legend? People had tried to play this game of truth or dare with him by looking in a mirror and saying his name 5 times to see if he really does exist or if it's all just an elaborate hoax. People also have this whole belief about the whole Bloody Mary thing too. If you say her name 3 times, will she come out? People have tried to dare to say it. But then people just sort of take a step back and realize maybe you better not. So it's up to Helen to go out on this whole mission to see if this urban legend close to home is real or if it's all just an urban legend. Even taking her to one of the most notorious communities in the Chicago area, the Cabrini Green area, which has always been an epicenter for a lot of gangster activities and not exactly one of the most safest areas to raise a family or even to seek residency. The Cabrini Green projects in Chicago was that not always like that. I mean, at one time it was a very immaculate middle class area. But then once they stopped, like maintaining the buildings, then it just pretty much fell to pieces after. It became run down. The prices of staying there were low. And the ghetto activity started to become more and more frequent to the point where you walk down the area, it's all smeared with graffiti paint and vandalism. And nobody gives a shit. This is no place to raise a family or to actually seek residency in. Hell, in fact, even some of the residency in the Cabrini Green actually also, to add a little authenticity in this movie, they eventually were even hired as extras. And many people said that even the camera crew during this project were not 100% safe or gangster free. I mean, there was some unexpected acts of hoodlum during the making of this movie. And while Bernadette is a bit reluctant to go into Cabrini Green, Helen, who throughout pretty much the first half of the movie still thinks that Candyman is just a legend. As I expected over the years that many film critics, well, they've always dismissed slasher films to be a one-note, see-all, kill-all monster movies where the demonic entities have one thing on their minds: murder. But the Candyman doesn't just depend on killing all that comes my way. In fact, as the years go by, personally, I've always found that Candyman stands out as one of the most underrated movies of the 1990s. And what I mean by underrated movies is that it's often dismissed as a slasher movie, but I don't think that's entirely the case. Because when I think of slasher movies, I think in order for me to qualify a slasher movie, I would need at least something like 7 on-camera deaths. 7 or more. Minimum 7. In the movie Candyman, there's really only one true grisly death in this movie, really. I mean, sure, there are deaths, but a lot of them are either off camera or they're not all 100% done by the Candyman himself. Yes, this movie is to some extent a slasher movie, but I don't see it too much as a slasher movie. I see it more closer to a horror drama as opposed to a horror thriller like you would see from the Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween movies. That would be qualifying more closer to a horror thriller. This one, sure, it's got the slasher stuff. Sure, it's got dead bodies. Sure, it's got blood. Sure, it's got gore and carnage. But it's very few and far between. Most of the movie actually passes more closer to a mystery thriller. There is a thriller in this, but it also has a little bit of a much more kind of almost like a Hardy Boys, a much more darker version of the Nancy Drew's Hardy Boys type series where we are trying to solve the mystery if whether or not Candyman exists or if he's a myth. And yeah, we have Helen doing some like amateur detective work by actually going onto the scenes in the Cabrini Green area to see if there really is a Candyman who claims to have taken victims there too, including one person by the name of Ruthie Jean who met her fatality through the Candyman, or some young adult who was disabled who got castrated by the Candyman. We are all curious about the Candyman, and the Candyman makes it clear that he doesn't make his presence till pretty much almost a little bit past the halfway mark. But in a way, that's good, because sometimes you know what the old saying goes, less means more. I mean, if he was to show up in the beginning, it would have just passed off as just another fine line of slasher film silliness. But in this movie, we don't have slasher film silliness in here. Candyman's not killing for the sake of fun. Candyman is just trying to solidify his reputation as part of an urban legend, and his killings are basically just to give him that power. But if you don't believe in the Candyman, he loses his power. Or at least he just feels somewhat insecure about losing his power. So that's why he went out and killed a whole bunch of people in this movie. And when you think about all these monster movies from the slasher films in the 80s, from your Jason Voorhees to your Hellraiser to Pinhead, Freddy Krueger's, Chucky, Leprechaun, Jigsaw, you name it, Ghostface. Killing is just not something he does for fun. He does it for power. He does it to keep his legend intact, so that you will become a believer. In fact, as the years go by, Candyman stands out as one of the most underrated movies in the 90s. In fact, many of the scenes that pan out in this movie are much more deep-rooted, philosophical, and provocative. And it also deals with a lot of political issues in this movie regarding race, because there's a lot of concepts of race in this movie. Being how, there was this saying that when Ruthie Jean died, no cops showed up till like days later because, oh, well, it's just a black person dead in the Cabrini Green projects. But then when Helen, who didn't die, but her eyes were totally fucked up when some hoodlum who was serenading himself as the Candyman practically beat the shit out of her, causing her eyes to be very swollen. Even though weeks later, her eyes are pretty much back intact. Everybody just rushed to the scene right away. It's like, it's kind of strange how a black person dies, gets killed, and the police seem to take their jolly sweet time. Oh, but when a white girl gets to near death, it becomes the fucking front page news. And of course, Candyman just, I don't know whether it was through irony or if it was just actually meant to be this way, but Candyman was filmed around 1992, pretty much roughly at around the time with the famous LA riots, which of course related to the racial beatdown when 11 white cops practically beat the living crap out of Rodney King. Even though it has been confirmed that Rodney King himself was no saint, he did commit an acts of misdemeanors, but I don't think it had to go to the extent where he practically literally got beat the shit out of him by the cops. So there are a lot of philosophical things that go around about him. Many people have said that Candyman was met with mixed reviews as to why they made Candyman such a standout villain, being the fact that he was an African American version of the Boogeyman. Now, of course, some people will say that this movie could be based off of racism because they just don't like the idea of having Candyman play a villain where, many people want to, make stories of African Americans in a more positive light. Candyman being an African American as a slasher villain just doesn't seem right for them because they want African Americans to have a more positive image in movies. Candyman does not have those kind of possessions. Also, other people actually praised Candyman for being made into an African American because finally, yes, we have ourselves a black slasher film villain. But you never know, some of these masked villains that you see in slasher films, they could have easily been black. They didn't necessarily always have to be Caucasian, except for Freddy Krueger. I personally think that nobody else can do Freddy Krueger than Robert Englund. Just like, Tony Todd as Candyman, nobody else can do Candyman except for Tony Todd. So if Robert Englund should ever decide to, push daisies, I don't think it would be right to have another person replace Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger. Just like I don't think anybody should ever play Candyman except for Tony Todd. If Tony Todd either retires or dies, Candyman should go with him too, because I don't think anybody else could ever replace Tony Todd as Candyman. Sure, there's this shock value in this movie that is found in all slasher films. And it could be graphic and gory. And there are a lot of slasher film elements in there. But the scars and the concepts add more to the fear factor, being that it's played with a meaning as opposed to being random like what you would find in Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street. You see, this 1992 version of Candyman doesn't have, 10, 20 stupid teenagers getting killed off like you would see in a Friday the 13th or a Nightmare on Elm Street or even Halloween. In fact, like I said, there are about 7 characters that die. 6 are human. One, of course, also features a decapitated dog with his head off. There is a lot of blood in this movie. That might make you think slasher film, but I also like to look at it as closer more to like a dramatic tragedy type story. Very similar to like one of those Greek tragedies, or even something along the lines of Phantom of the Opera. And unlike the other slasher movie villains, where you have the mutes like Freddy Krueger and no, not Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers, they don't really say anything. They just let their actions do all the talking. And unlike, like Freddy Krueger and Chucky, there is no like sly humor or diabolical stuff. There is no dark humor or witty banter that comes out of the Candyman's dialogue. His motives depend more on tragedy drama, which is quite original and makes for a more effective villain. Because let's face it, villains in real life, when they do evil things, not all of them have these like eccentric, evil, dark humor. Candyman's not going to be cracking jokes. He's not going to be telling stupid one-liners or things like that. He'll play mind games. He could get physical and brutal when he wants to with zero sympathy or remorse. But like I said, this movie plays more closer to a drama than it is to a thriller or a dark comedy. I mean, by the time you see one Friday the 13th movie, you practically kind of almost sit back and laugh. And no, I don't condone you killing people with a machete or do like what Freddy Krueger does and his acts of brutality. I don't condone that. I'm not a sadist or anything like that. But this movie really has a more dramatic turn. His mind games mostly comes from Helen. I mean, even though Candyman does materialize, at least from Helen's perspectives, but when he kills, you don't really actually ever see his presence. Instead, you see Helen's, which is probably the reason why Helen is often seen being a bit of being Candyman's kind of sacrificial goat. Of course, I know Helen throughout the time during Candyman's road of carnage, she ends up having to play sort of a bit of a thankless role, by trying to prove her sanity by saying that it's not me that was behind the killings, and it's Candyman. But Candyman's not going to back her up. In fact, he's trying to invite Helen to join him as they could become together, that they could be immortal. And that his killings are all doing it for her. And then when she finds out that, her boyfriend Trevor has decided to dump her and decides to have his new girlfriend, who is also one of his students, to shack up with him, she kind of knew that there was nobody else. She doesn't have Bernadette. She doesn't have Trevor. She doesn't have anyone. Nobody will believe her story. So she finally ends up deciding to become him. She decided that she was going to just turn to him. Since he's got nobody else, what the fuck does she have to lose? I mean, I don't think she actually ever minded being his sacrificial lamb. But she also wanted baby Anthony to be spared. After all, he did kidnap Anne Marie's son, Anthony, even though it came at the cost of decapitating their family dog in a gruesome scene. But at least he didn't really kill the kid. I mean, he kept him quiet. He nurtured him, even giving him honey. But still, she didn't want. She eventually. I mean, sure, Candyman did meet his fate in the end, which is a bit of a plot hole since isn't he already a ghost? But he gets killed off in the end. He gets burned to death. When isn't he supposed to be some kind of demonic ghost? But I don't know. I guess that is a bit of a plot hole. Helen eventually manages to make it out of the fire that Cabrini Green residents did, because they thought that Helen, who also had a hook for it, was also sporting a hook to get herself out of the fire to rescue Anthony. She managed to escape. The baby was spared, but then the burns in her hair became so overwhelmed it got into her head, and she eventually suffered from severe burns from rescuing Anthony that she also fell to his death. And then there's the final scenes where Trevor is moping in the bathroom while his new girlfriend was cooking food. And then he starts calling out her name 5 times in the mirror, and all of a sudden she shows up, and she eventually slashes him. Which actually kind of makes me wonder, did she only just was like a one-time only deal? So in other words, if you don't say the Candyman's name 5 times, and instead you say Helen's name 5 times, does that mean she's gonna materialize? I don't know. I don't kind of get it. And then of course, in 1995, we had the sequel, Candyman, Farewell to the Flesh. And then in 1999, Day of the Dead. But you don't see Helen anymore. I guess her getting revenge on Trevor was just a one-time deal. Some people might have thought this movie was a little bit on the sexist side. On the one hand, Helen is, of course, working on her thesis on the Candyman, and then she's joined by Trevor and some other know-it-all professor who did a project on the Candyman and used his know-it-all wit to usurp her, or to do his mansplaining. And of course, her exploring into these things has often been sort of a bit of an epicenter of ridicule. So she really gets grilled here by these people. I mean, so there is a little bit of some levels of sexism, but although it's not like as over the top. And when she does finally get her revenge on Trevor, it could be a little bit of some women's lib type manifesto with with her slashing him as a way of saying, "Oh, since you didn't want me anymore, actually, to be honest with you, I don't need you either. And while you're gonna be lying dead in your own pool of blood, my legacy will live on." So I'm not actually sure if this was just a one-time deal, or now I guess if you say Helen's name 5 times, she will come. I don't know. There were other things that was also kind of like race issues and all that. Is you could take a look at the class systems between the white characters and the black characters. But the black characters, they pretty much all live in condemned slum type atmosphere. I mean, the Cabrini Green residence does not actually live in one of the cleanest establishments. The apartment is pretty much all messed up with with graffiti, and it's pretty much garbage infested. Anne Marie's apartment is small and crampy, and this is not exactly the best place to raise a family. They go into a resident bathroom and it's smelly and disgusting, and there's bees swarming all over it. Ugh. And even people were also graffitiing their walls, smearing shit on the walls too. Ugh. This is no place for residents. Thank God they tore it down in 2011. Nobody in their right mind would want to live there. Unless you have no luck. And then you look at the white characters, well, with the exception of Bernadette, played by Cassie Lemmons, everyone else seems to, all the white characters tend to live in much more neater, nicer looking establishments. Little more luxurious. Maybe not fancy schmancy, but at least more cleaner. Which kind of is a bit disturbing in many ways. And kind of inconvenient, but I guess that was just part of the trajectory of the story, or where it raises some issues just through sheer looks of observation, I suppose. So the Candyman, his powers come from the myth of his existence, and when people stop believing in him, his powers start to fade. So that's the motives behind his killings. The performances in this movie were played out very effectively. From the scary, evil ways that Candyman, played by Tony Todd, possesses, which also rests on the platform of dark tragedy, to the effectiveness and of a curious, albeit skeptical university student like Helen Lyle, played by Virginia Madsen. The chemistry between these two has an impact that is pure magical in its substance. I mean, they played off very well. Tony Todd sold his performance as Candyman. Practically almost has complete control of it. Sure, Bernard Rose directed the movie. Sure, he wrote the script. Sure, it was based off of The Forgiven. But it's Tony Todd who had a lot of more creative control about how Candyman should look, how he should act. I mean, Tony Todd has possession of Candyman perhaps to more greater rights than compared to Bernard Rose or Clive Parker. Just like, Virginia Madsen as Helen Lyle, she had some deep levels of creative control over how she wanted her protagonist character to be portrayed. Sure, she was skeptical. Sure, she would often, at times, debunk those who believe in the Candyman. But she just makes it that way. One of the great release about this movie is that the movie is not dependent on fucking scream queens who scream every 5-10 seconds. Bernard Rose, I agree with you completely. Those scream queens screaming every 5, 10, 15 minutes is enough to give you a fucking headache. And the shit just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating itself over and over and over again. And it becomes to a point where it becomes more monotonous and taxing than it is enjoyable. And I'm just glad that this movie did not have that. In fact, Helen's approach to Candyman isn't through screaming. In fact, she seems more hypnotic by his powers. In fact, it even took a professional hypnotist to kind of put her in a bit of a trance. Especially when it came to like the bee swallowing scenes, which just really, really totally grosses me out, even to this day. This is kind of like where the horror factor comes in, but it's also played to a more dramatical effect as well. And I'm just glad they used real bees and not CGI like they would probably do today. I mean, they actually had... And did you know that Tony Todd was stung during this whole production 23 times? Of course, for every sting that he endured, the production had to pay him $1,000. So he eventually, aside from his normal salary he got from making this movie, he also became $23,000 a little more extra richer. I mean, Virginia Madsen also went through this whole hypnotic stage of sometimes even being completely oblivious and weary of her surroundings. She just really, really, really stuck it to us. I would also like to say that the score, composed by Philip Glass, is quite breathtaking. That has the right tension to the film of this magnitude. Even though it's played through just simple uses of just the piano, some organ playing, and some chorus in the background, it just brings that atmosphere more to life than compared to the other slasher movies. Sure, others have pointed out that the film did not age well due to the styles and clothes being permanently stuck in the 90s. Yeah, okay, I agree. But then again, that's the way people used to dress in the 90s. And yes, this definitely has the whole 90s vibe to it. Especially when Helen sees candy on the ground, and when she unwraps it, it was actually frickin' razor blades. So, yeah, this movie really did actually felt 90s. And the archaic feel gives a great taste of nostalgia to more simpler times. I know saying that is a cliche. And though I mentioned that the Candyman lore is not just built up to scare the viewers out of their seats, but just like most of the other entities from the Clive Barker series, including Hellraiser, the villains have a certain motive as to why they vow revenge on those who provoke him. When Helen dismisses his existence to the residences of the Cabrini Green projects in Chicago, especially to the young boy named Jake, he vows to take those who threaten his presence. However, though he may have spared Jake, but Jake believed in him, so he was given the dismissal. However, many other people who did not believe in him met their fate. Unfortunately, her friend Bernadette, even though she was suspicious, she never fully believed him. The dog, well, I think he just wanted to shut him up, which is why he was decapitated. I think the most grisly fatality came in Dr. Burke's office, where he really rammed his hook through him. It was awful, but it was the most darkest scene in this movie. People who are skeptical of him will definitely meet their fate. Tony Todd, like I said, was the rightful choice to cast Candyman. From his towering height to his grotesque figure and the hook for a hand and the bees surrounding him and his ripped up rib cage being exposed. He just looked like a one real sick, horrific entity. He is just a walking, talking eyesore of a spirit. He doesn't show up until halfway mark of the film, but his build-up to when he finally shows up will make the viewer unsettled. And through his dialogue and scary presence, he doesn't say much, but we know that he's desperate for Helen's love and wants her to be part of his world. But what differs himself compared to the other slasher film monsters is his unpredictable nature stands above the rest. He's not killing because of thrills, he's killing it to save his reputation. Under the careful detail of Clive Barker's story, with new twists that break away from its original intentions, the stylistic direction from Bernard Rose, and finally the more intense dramatic performances by Tony Todd, can still provide scares and deaths, and adds more dimension to the character that's contrary to the other slasher characters. It is truly a classic of its genre. It's just a shame that the other incarnates that came out later kind of unfortunately met their kind of like just became as the traditional slasher film, like Farewell to the Flesh and Day of the Dead. Yeah, it just became a mindless slasher film. I haven't seen the new version of it yet, but I would love to do a review on that sometime soon in the future. But for now, if I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would give Candyman from 1992 a 9 out of 10. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my YouTube channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember the 3 simple rules. Be kind, be courteous, and please refrain from any rude comments. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Correct Writer saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.